Welcome to the Auros and Auros IQ session. Remember, keep that chat open. Feel free to write comments and questions throughout the session. We will take Q&A if there are any. And now let's welcome Technical Services Manager and Knowledge Aware Consultant from Auros Knowledge Systems, Josh Cullis. Hi, Josh.
How's it going, Amy? How are you?
Good, thanks. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Like Amy said, we're going to talk a little bit about how we use Auros here at Auros Knowledge Systems. This presentation we started a few years back, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the learning points that we'll go through. We'll start off with just a background, kind of our implementation of the knowledge aware approach and of Auros IQ. We'll talk a little bit about some updates on some use cases that we've touched on before. Specifically, we'll go into strategic planning, talk a little bit about our seed project management and how that's kind of led into a new use case or new workflow that we're working on putting into Auros. We'll talk a little bit about the evolution of our software factory over the past 12 months. And then we'll also talk about just our usage at a glance. So we'll go through some of the statistics associated with our implementation, usage trends, those types of things. So to start off with the background of our implementation, kind of put together a little bit of a timeline. Our implementation started around 2014. We had usage of the software prior to that, but like a significant use of the knowledge aware approach and using the software to kind of manage different processes that we had started then. These are kind of some of the highlights of the processes that we've gone through. So we onboarded our software factory. We onboarded our process of seed project management. So we call the onboarding of a new workflow a seed project. We kind of plant the seed and it grows and expands from there. That's where the terminology comes from. And when we onboarded our seed project process and the management of that activity, that's where we really started to see an uptick in the use of the software. So that led to employee hiring, the pursuit of opportunities, strategic planning, customer health as the years have gone on. We now manage our information security management. The backlog of our product plan is in the software. Years we've done this presentation and kind of talked about new workflows that we've brought on board as the implementation has continued to expand. I think this year is going to be a little bit different because what's happened as we've gone through this process and onboarded a lot of these workflows is we've been able to use this knowledge aware approach to continuously learn and make some fairly significant improvements or expansions of certain processes within the software. So the first one is that strategic planning. We'll talk a little bit about how that process has evolved, how we started to apply it in other areas of the business, not just planning strategically for our company. We'll talk a little bit about the seed project management, how that's kind of evolved into something that we're calling a knowledge aware workflow audit. We'll talk a little bit as well about our software factory and how it's evolved over time. So if we start off with our use case updates, we'll start with strategic planning. If you're not familiar with this, we have a process that we go through from an organizational standpoint. It has a lot of things that are involved with communication to employees, setting different targets, setting different objectives, and then establishing work that's going to be done in order to achieve those targets or those objectives. So within this process, we have an annual planning meeting where we produce objectives for the calendar year, for the year for us. Those objectives then get kind of distilled down into actionable activities, and we keep those activities scoped to a 3-month time frame so that we have things that can get accomplished. And we've had a lot of success doing this. We've made a lot of improvements. A lot of those activities or objectives were related to onboarding new workflows into Auros. And as we were going through this process this year, we kind of had a thought that we could take this and we could start to use it in other areas of the business, maybe in some of our customer growth and expansion processes, where we can look at a term and say, what are the things that maybe a customer is struggling with? How can we help them achieve those things? How can we help the software grow at their organization? And the structure of this strategic planning, kind of defining these objectives. We start with a 3-year objective, we go down to a 1-year, and then we start to kind of understand, okay, well, what would it take to achieve that 1-year objective? And we break those down into something that we call continuous improvement bricks. So as we were going through that, we thought, this may be valuable for our customer growth and expansion process. So because we had it in Auros already, it was pretty straightforward to just take it and integrate it into the growth and expansion that we were already managing in Auros as well. So we kind of piloted it with a couple different groups. We walked through and kind of identified challenges that certain customers were facing. How can we help them overcome that? And you can see the step here in our method that we use to kind of manage that. So we still have planning that goes on. We still have health evaluations that we've talked about in the past that we facilitate throughout the term. But we also have this active strategic planning that we want to continuously go through and touch on and make sure that we're achieving the objectives that we set at the beginning of the term. So like I said, the way we do that is we have 3-year objectives. Those boil down into 1-year objectives, which then turn into continuous improvement bricks that we create as an issue type in Auros. So you can kind of see we create these bricks. They are things that are containable within 3 months so that we can make progress in shorter spans of time, eventually leading to the accomplishment of the 1-year objective, which then leads toward the accomplishment of the 3-year objective. So having these processes in Auros, refining the way that we kind of manage them, and then making the connections as we're going through these processes, and then implementing them into the new process was facilitated in a lot of ways by using this knowledge-aware technique. And we found a lot of value. We started doing that earlier this year, tracking it in this way. We had a lot of good engagement with customers in the past, but kind of tracking it in a more formal way of what we're trying to accomplish as our team expanded became a lot more important. And this was a mechanism that allowed us to take it from our company-wide strategic planning and move it over into our customer growth process. Now we can ensure that teams are doing things consistently as the customer base expands, as the application engineering team and the business development team within our organization expand. Previously, the group wasn't quite as big, so it was a little bit easier to manage consistency across the groups. But as the group expands, this gives us a nice way to really formally track these things and have a good idea of what's going on at each customer implementation. So this was, I forgot to skip forward, but this just shows that a lot of times we'll have multiple objectives or one objective that produces multiple bricks. You stack a few different bricks on top of each other and they achieve the objective. So the next use case that we wanted to talk a little bit about the maturity of it and the evolution was our seed project management, and the kind of how that's led to something that we're looking to implement here. And we've been working on over the last probably 6 weeks, which is the knowledge-aware workflow audit. So when we manage seed projects, we have a collection of standard work. As we go through that standard work, we have different points in the process where we do peer reviews. These peer reviews are designed to essentially identify, there's 2 purposes of the peer review. One is to communicate to other members of the team implementations, the different things that are happening at different customer sites. So it serves that purpose, but it's also used to identify risk associated with the project. Do we have the right people involved? Is the configuration done in a way that's knowledge aware? Are the features in the software being used as they were intended? So these things are different checkpoints throughout our seed project management process. And then once we transition a project into production, we have the customer growth that we just looked at, and we kind of manage those things with the customer. Well, what we found is once workflows were transitioned over to production, the engagement kind of changed and there wasn't quite as much interaction. The interaction with the customer groups wasn't as frequent. And we found that there was a potential opportunity for improvement as new features come out. We communicate those through things like release notes, and we do software reviews with customers. But what we weren't necessarily doing is going to each individual workflow and identifying for that workflow how some of these features could benefit them, maybe some best practices that have been developed since they did their seed project. How can they incorporate those best practices into their workflow? So what that kind of led to was the idea of being able to take this information that's happening in the peer reviews and then apply it and audit existing workflows. So it's really good that we're applying those things to our onboarding process, but we also thought that there could be some value with those items if we go out, talk to existing workflows, potentially audit them on some sort of cadence. And we're coming up with, how we want to manage that. Obviously, we want to engage customers with that activity so that we can get their feedback on it, provide them value. But we've found another way that we can use the content in this peer review to facilitate improvements of workflows. As we're going through this, one of the things that's kind of interesting that we didn't foresee is now that we're going through, we're auditing workflows, it's giving us a different type of exposure to those workflows and how they've evolved over time. And what that's led to, and in the short period of time that we've done these pilots, is our ability to now go back to the seed project process and start to adjust the best practices, because we have different exposure to different use cases, the way that customers have kind of evolved over time. And that's led to this continuous improvement opportunity where now we've developed additional best practices. And we've looked at, Jeff kind of talked a little bit about this in his presentation to start the conference off, this concept of assessment first. So these knowledge-aware workflow audits in their infancy, they haven't even been rolled out to production. We've just piloted them, and they've already produced some value for us that's allowed us to kind of improve that seed project process. So this is another use case and a workflow that we're really happy with the way that the knowledge-aware approach has helped us improve. So the next use case is our software factory. There's a lot that I could probably talk about. There are a lot of things that have changed within our software factory over the past 9 months. So I'll kind of walk through some of that here. And obviously, if you have questions about anything, feel free to jump in. But we onboarded our software factory, like you saw in the beginning, in 2014. At that time, we didn't have a completely waterfall approach where we plan everything and then accomplish it over the course of 3 to 6 months. There were some agile principles mixed into what we did, but from a planning and a tracking perspective, a lot of what we did was waterfall. So we started thinking about, are there ways that we can start to incorporate agile methodologies? We kind of made a transition at the beginning of this year to go completely over to the agile process when it comes to actually implementing software features. So when we first started that, we had a number of different phases within our process because it kind of came from this generally waterfall methodology up front. So we started to incorporate sprints into the different phases. As we continued to evolve and we continued to kind of use this agile methodology, we got a lot of benefit out of it. We used the team board for it. I'll show a little bit of that here in a minute. But we had all these different phases, and there were steps in the process that, because we were iterating, because we were evaluating risk and change and software features on a more continuous basis through this agile tracking mechanism, what we found is there were a lot of steps in that waterfall process that weren't necessary anymore. So we've recently been able to take these 4 phases where we tracked a lot of information and kind of consolidate those into one phase. So now we still have a product plan that's managed in Auros. We still have sprints that we iterate. We do 2-week sprints. Once one's complete, we start a new one. So we still have the standard work for those things here in our process, but they've been moved into one central location as opposed to being replicated over the 4 different phases. And then the steps within the process have been consolidated only to the things that are necessary now that we have these other mechanisms to kind of manage the evolution of the software. So this is now one method that we're managing as opposed to the 4 that we had previously. It's been consolidated. It allows us to still manage the general work, but also facilitate communication in a much more efficient way, because we're able to put this on a team board. All of the software engineers, all of our design engineers, the different stakeholders from a business perspective have access to this. They can see, how we are progressing through the process at one central location, one view. We're able to then use the assessment wall to kind of track all of the standard work items to closure. If you haven't seen previous presentations, we have standard work at different steps of the process through this software change lifecycle, and we manage that through assessments. So our design engineers have an assessment of standard work that they complete. Our software engineers have the same thing. And as we're going through the process and assigning that work out, we're able to use these Kanban visualizations to kind of track that work to closure. So from evaluation ready through to assessment complete. In the assessment scenario, same thing with issues. As things come up, as challenges are faced, we can create issues, we can track that. And throughout this entire process, we're establishing this data footprint that we'll be able to learn from moving forward. So this is a screenshot of that issues wall where we're able to kind of take these items, track them to closure, move them from left to right as problems come up within the standard work process. And then in addition to that, we have a bunch of different items here on our report wall that allows us to kind of manage information. We understand where the workloads are, all that kind of stuff. So now that we've gone through some use case updates, we have the usage at a glance. So we'll talk a little bit about just some of the statistics associated with our implementation. We did this last year, so I kind of wanted to follow up and give an update on where we were from a statistical perspective. Last year, we had 40 different distinct workflows. I think this year we have 42. You can probably make some arguments that there are more than that. I kind of thought the expansion of some of these things didn't really count as a new distinct workflow, but things like software engineering standard work, even though that's part of the software factory, it kind of is a distinct workflow. So only an uptick in 42 there, from 40 to 42. But we've had a lot of expansion, and that can kind of be shown in the next statistic. So we had 11,000 knowledge packets in 2021. We now are up to 15,000. So even though we didn't really have a significant uptick in distinct workflows, you can see that our knowledge packets increased by 35%. Our user base, as the company starts to grow, I think we're pretty much at saturation. Everyone within our organization is using Auros on a regular basis. So we have onboarded the partner portal. We have a few different customers that actually participate in our processes through that functionality that we didn't talk about. And then we've also expanded the team by a number of people as well, which has led to a slight increase in distinct users, even though we're at saturation. And then the last item that we kind of talked about last year was just our knowledge events per day. So last year we were around 2.5 thousand, so 2,500 knowledge events per day. And here we're not quite at an average of 3,000 now, but we're approaching 3,000. We have multiple days where we'll have 3,500 knowledge events in one individual day. And our average is getting up near 3,000 on a daily basis.